Part 1: The Snowboard. I always knew there was something eerie about the mountains. You could feel it when the wind cut through the pine trees, sending shivers down your spine as if nature itself was trying to warn you. But I ignored it, chalking it up to the excitement of my first snowboarding trip in years. I had rented a cabin alone, wanting to escape the noise of the city. The drive up had been uneventful, the roads winding through endless forests, the kind where you feel like you're the only person left on Earth. But as soon as I stepped out of the car and took a deep breath of that crisp mountain air, I felt a sense of dread. It wasn't like the fear you feel when you're in danger. It was subtler, like a knot tightening in your gut, whispering that something wasn't right. The first day was perfect. Powder snow, no crowds, and a bright sun that made the whole mountain shimmer. It was as if the mountain was trying to lure me in with its beauty. I spent hours riding, carving my way through fresh snow, the cold wind biting at my cheeks, and I felt alive. It wasn't until I stopped at a small, isolated cafe at the base of the mountain that I noticed something strange. An old man, with leathery skin and deep wrinkles etched into his face like the very mountains around us, sat in the corner, watching me. I tried to ignore him, but he kept staring, his eyes unblinking and cold. When I finally met his gaze, he smiled, revealing crooked, yellowed teeth. That's when he said something that stuck with me. "You shouldn't be here." I laughed it off, assuming he was just some local drunk, but I couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to it. As I left, he grabbed my arm with a grip much stronger than I expected. "The mountain doesn't like people like you," he whispered. "It'll show you." I yanked my arm free, mumbling something about minding his own business, but his words lingered, echoing in my head as I made my way back to the cabin. That night, as I sat by the fire, I heard something. It was faint, almost like a whisper carried by the wind. I paused, listening intently, but the sound vanished as quickly as it had come. I brushed it off, blaming it on the creaking wood of the cabin or maybe even the wind outside. But then, I saw it. The snowboard leaning against the wall near the fireplace. I could have sworn I left it outside, propped up against the porch railing. The board's edges glistened, and the mountain design etched on its surface seemed to shift in the flickering light. I shook my head, convincing myself I must have brought it inside without remembering. It had been a long day after all. But as I lay in bed that night, staring at the ceiling, I couldn't stop thinking about that old man's words. I should have listened. Part 2: The Shadows in the Snow. The next morning, I woke up with a start. My dreams had been filled with jagged peaks and deep, yawning chasms, as if the mountain was trying to swallow me whole. The unease from the previous night still lingered, and when I looked over to the fireplace, I saw that the snowboard had moved again. This time, it was lying flat on the floor, pointing toward the front door like an arrow. I chalked it up to a gust of wind, or maybe that I'd knocked it over without realizing it. But something gnawed at the back of my mind, reminding me that the doors and windows had been shut all night. Determined to shake off the creeping paranoia, I decided to head back up the mountain. I strapped the board to my feet and made my way to the lift, trying to convince myself that everything was fine, that I was just being ridiculous. But as I boarded the lift and ascended the mountain, I felt a prickle on the back of my neck. Felt like I was being watched. When I reached the top, the entire landscape spread out before me, pristine and untouched. I was the first one up that morning, the snow so smooth it looked like an endless sheet of white silk. I took a deep breath, trying to focus on the thrill of the ride. I pushed off and felt the familiar rush as the board glided effortlessly over the powder. But as I descended, something caught my eye. In the distance, on a ridge to my left, there was a figure, a man standing perfectly still. He was dressed in a heavy black coat, and even from this distance, I could feel his gaze locked on me. I stopped, squinting against the sun to get a better look, but before I could wave or shout, he was gone, as if he'd simply vanished into thin air. An uneasy chill settled over me, and for a moment, I considered heading back to the cabin. But I forced myself to keep going, determined not to let fear ruin my trip. About halfway down, I stumbled upon something strange. A series of tracks crisscrossed the slope, but they weren't from skis or snowboards. They were footprints, bare footprints, as if someone had walked through the snow without shoes. I followed them, curiosity outweighing my better judgment, until they disappeared at the edge of a small cliff. I peered over the edge, but there was nothing there. Just a drop into darkness, as if the mountain had opened up to swallow whoever had made those tracks. I couldn't explain it, and I felt that creeping dread return, stronger now, whispering that something was terribly wrong. I turned to leave, but that's when I noticed something else. The snow around me was stained red. Blood. It was smeared across the snow in wide arcs, as if something or someone had been dragged. Panic set in, and I took off down the mountain, the board barely keeping up with the frantic movements of my legs. I didn't stop until I reached the base, panting and shaking. I glanced around, expecting to see someone, anyone who could explain what I just witnessed, but I was alone, completely and utterly alone. Back at the cabin, I tried to calm down, convincing myself that it was all some bizarre prank. Maybe that old man from the cafe had put someone up to it. Maybe he'd seen the fear in my eyes and decided to play a trick. But deep down, I knew that wasn't true. That night, as I lay in bed, I heard the whispering again. This time it was clearer, more insistent. I sat up, straining to make out the words, and felt my blood turn to ice. The voice was calling my name. I leaped out of bed, heart hammering in my chest, and that's when I saw it. The snowboard. It was leaning against the wall, but now it was different. Scratched into the surface were deep, jagged marks, as if someone had dragged a knife down its length. And beneath those scratches, written in what looked like dried blood, was a single word: leave. I backed away, shaking, but I knew it was already too late. The mountain had its eyes on me now, and there was no escape. Part 3, The Man with No Face. I barely slept that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw flashes of the blood in the snow, of those bare footprints leading to the cliff's edge. The whispering voice that called my name was relentless, echoing in my ears long after I'd woken up, and the word leave scratched into the snowboard was burned into my memory. The next morning, I decided to head into town, thinking maybe I could shake off this madness if I were around other people. I grabbed my jacket, laced up my boots, and stepped outside, only to stop dead in my tracks. The snow surrounding my cabin was covered in more of those footprints. Hundreds of them, all bare, weaving in and out in chaotic patterns, leading right up to my doorstep. My breath caught in my throat as I turned to look at my car. The tires were slashed, deep gashes carved into the rubber, leaving me stranded. And there, tied to my door handle, was a bundle of sticks twisted together to form a crude, human-like figure. The figure had no face, but a red X had been painted where the head should be. My hands trembled as I reached out to touch it, and that's when I felt the heat. It started off faint, barely noticeable, but grew stronger as I stood there. It felt like the air was vibrating, pulsing with energy, and that's when I heard it, the faint, rhythmic crunch of footsteps behind me. I spun around, but there was nothing there, just the empty, snow-covered landscape. I could still feel it, though. Someone or something was watching me. I grabbed the twisted figure, threw it into the snow, and ran to the car, hoping that maybe I could fix the tires, or at the very least, find a way to call for help. As I crouched down beside the car, examining the damage, I caught movement out of the corner of my eye. I glanced up and saw him again, the man in the black coat, standing at the edge of the woods. This time I could see him more clearly. He was tall and gaunt, his limbs too long and awkward, as if they didn't belong to him. But it was his face, or rather, the absence of it, that made my blood run cold. He had no features, just smooth, pale skin stretched over a skull. No eyes, no mouth, nothing. Just a blank, lifeless mask staring straight at me. I stumbled back, my legs giving way, and fell into the snow. I scrambled to get up, but when I looked back, he was gone, as if he'd never been there at all. I staggered back into the cabin, locking the door behind me and double-checking every window. My heart was pounding in my ears, drowning out every rational thought, every logical explanation I tried to muster. I picked up my phone to call for help, only to find that there was no signal. No surprise, really, there never was up in these mountains. But now it felt like more than a simple inconvenience. It felt like I was being cut off, isolated, like something didn't want me to leave. I sank into the armchair by the fireplace, trying to gather my thoughts. There had to be a reason for all of this, some explanation I was missing. Maybe I was just exhausted. Maybe the altitude was getting to me, or maybe I was losing my mind. But deep down, I knew it was something far worse. As I sat there, I caught a glimpse of the snowboard from the corner of my eye. I didn't want to look at it, but something compelled me, drawing me in. I turned my head slowly, and that's when I saw it. There was a new scratch on the board, another message carved deep into the surface. Tonight. A wave of nausea hit me, and I doubled over, fighting the urge to vomit. I didn't understand what was happening, but one thing was certain. I wasn't welcome here. And then I heard it, the sound that would haunt me for the rest of my life. It started as a faint, muffled thud, coming from above. I froze, my ears straining, trying to make sense of it. But then it came again, louder this time. A rhythmic pounding, like heavy boots stomping across the ceiling. Someone was up there. My blood turned to ice as I stared at the ceiling, watching the dust fall with every thud. I backed away, keeping my eyes fixed on the noise, and that's when I heard the voice again. Clearer this time and much closer. It wasn't a whisper anymore. It was a low, guttural growl, coming from just behind me. And it spoke 3 words that sent me running out the front door, into the snow, and away from that godforsaken cabin. You're not alone. Part 4, The Stalker in the Woods. I ran, my breath escaping in ragged gasps, heart thundering in my chest like a drumbeat. The snow crunched beneath my boots as I stumbled deeper into the woods, branches clawing at my face, the icy wind biting through my jacket. I didn't know where I was going, only that I needed to get as far away from that cabin as possible. But no matter how fast I ran, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. It was as if the shadows themselves were following me, whispering my name, mocking my every step. The darkness between the trees seemed to shift and writhe, moving in ways that shouldn't be possible. And then, I saw him again, the man with no face. He was standing just ahead, at the edge of a clearing, completely still. His head tilted slightly as if he was listening to something I couldn't hear. And then, without warning, he began to move toward me. It wasn't like a normal person's walk. It was jerky, disjointed, like a puppet on strings being dragged forward by some invisible force. My legs refused to move, my body frozen with terror as he drew closer, his featureless face reflecting the pale light of the moon. Every instinct screamed at me to run, to get away, but I couldn't tear my eyes from him. Then, just as suddenly as he'd started, he stopped. We stood there, facing each other in the middle of that desolate forest, the wind howling around us. And that's when I heard it. A soft, almost imperceptible sound, like someone whispering directly into my ear. I couldn't make out the words, but they were getting louder, more frantic, as if urging me to do something, to understand something. The faceless man raised one hand, pointing at something behind me. I didn't want to look, but it was as if my body moved on its own, my head turning against my will. That's when I saw it. The cabin. It shouldn't have been possible. I'd been running for what felt like hours, but there it was, just a few yards away. The door wide open, the warm light from the fireplace flickering inside. But it wasn't the cabin that terrified me the most. It was what I saw standing in the doorway. Me. It was like looking into a twisted mirror. There I stood, staring back at myself, but something was horribly, horribly wrong. My eyes were sunken, hollow, and my skin was stretched tight over my bones, the color of ash. I tried to back away, but my legs wouldn't move. My reflection took a step closer, raising one hand toward me, and that's when I felt it. Something cold and wet sliding down my arm. I looked down and saw that my skin was covered in blood. It oozed from deep gashes that hadn't been there before, and as I watched, the cuts grew deeper, the skin peeling away to reveal raw, pulsing flesh underneath. I stumbled backward, tearing my gaze away from the doorway, only to find that the faceless man had vanished. The whispering had grown louder now, almost deafening, a cacophony of voices that seemed to come from all around me. I fell to my knees, clutching my head, trying to drown them out, but it was no use. They were inside my skull, scratching and clawing, tearing at the fabric of my mind. I don't know how long I sat there, shaking, sobbing, unable to move, but eventually, the whispers faded, leaving only the sound of my ragged breathing and the crackling of distant fire. When I finally looked up, I realized I was back in the clearing. The faceless man was gone, the blood had vanished, and the only thing that remained was the twisted figure made of sticks, lying at my feet. I reached out, fingers trembling, and picked it up. The second I touched it, a jolt of electricity shot through me, and I heard something. A voice, clear as day, coming from the depths of the forest. It wants you to follow. I didn't have to ask what it was. I knew. I had known from the moment I set foot on this mountain, from the moment that old man warned me. There was something ancient here, something that thrived on fear, on isolation, on the cold, relentless grip of despair. And it had chosen me. I stumbled to my feet, clutching the stick figure in my hand, and began to walk back toward the cabin. I didn't want to go back. I knew that whatever waited for me there wasn't human. But I had no choice. The mountain had me now, and there was nowhere left to run. As I approached the cabin, I saw movement inside. The door was still open, and through the flickering light, I could see something moving just out of sight. It was crouched by the fireplace, its back turned to me, rocking back and forth, muttering to itself. I stepped inside, my breath catching in my throat as the warmth hit me. And that's when it turned around. It was me, but not quite. Its skin was mottled and gray, stretched so thin that I could see every bone, every tendon beneath. Its eyes were sunken and hollow, its lips pulled back into a twisted grin. And as it stared at me, it spoke in a voice that was mine but not mine, a distorted, warped echo of my own thoughts. "You can't leave," it said, crawling closer. "Not now. Not ever." I stumbled backward, my foot catching on something, and I fell. As I hit the floor, I saw the snowboard lying next to me, the words scratched into its surface glowing faintly in the firelight. There was a new message now, fresh and raw, like it had just been carved. "He's coming." I looked up, and in that moment, I knew. It wasn't just the mountain that wanted me. It was something else, something ancient and hungry, lurking just beyond the veil of reality, waiting for the moment when I was most vulnerable. I could feel it drawing closer, could feel its breath on the back of my neck, and I knew that if I turned around, I'd see it. And if I saw it, if I truly looked into its eyes, there'd be no escaping it. Ever. I shut my eyes tight, curling into a ball, and whispered the only thing I could think of, over and over again, like a prayer, like a desperate plea. "Please let me go. Please, let me go." And then, everything went black. Part 5, The Ritual. When I woke up, I was lying in the snow outside the cabin. My head throbbed, my body ached, and my breath came out in ragged, shallow gasps, crystallizing in the frigid air. The moon hung low in the sky, and I could see my breath fogging up in front of me, but everything else was deathly silent. No wind, no rustling trees. Nothing. It was as if the world had frozen in place. I tried to sit up, but a sharp pain shot through my leg. Looking down, I saw deep, jagged scratches running along my calf, like claw marks. My heart began to pound, and I struggled to remember what had happened. The faceless man, the twisted figure in the cabin, the words carved into the snowboard. I glanced around, trying to get my bearings, and that's when I saw it. Fresh tracks in the snow, leading away from the cabin and into the dense woods beyond. They weren't like the other footprints I'd seen. They were enormous, almost animalistic, but with too many toes, and each step was sunken deep, as if whatever had made them was incredibly heavy. The whispering started again, low and insistent, and this time I could make out fragments of words. "Follow, deeper, come closer." I didn't want to go. I wanted to get in my car, somehow fix the tires, and drive as far away from this nightmare as possible. But something inside me pulled me forward, a force beyond my control. I had to know. I had to understand what was happening, even if it killed me. I stumbled to my feet, my legs screaming in protest, and began to follow the tracks. They led me through the dense forest, past towering pines and twisted, gnarled branches that seemed to reach out, as if trying to drag me back. I pressed on, each step heavier than the last, the whispering growing louder with every passing second. The air grew colder, biting into my skin, and I pulled my jacket tighter around me. I felt the presence of the mountain more acutely now, as if it were alive, watching me with unseen eyes. And that's when I saw it, just ahead, bathed in the pale light of the moon, a clearing. In the center of the clearing stood a massive, twisted tree, its bark blackened and scarred, and its branches reaching out like skeletal fingers. At its base, surrounded by a ring of blood-stained snow, was a circle of stones, and in the center of that circle was the snowboard, propped up like a gravestone. I approached slowly, my heart pounding in my chest. The whispering had grown to a deafening roar, echoing off the trees, and I could feel the ground vibrating beneath my feet. As I stepped closer, I saw that the snowboard had been covered in fresh carvings. Symbols I didn't recognize, intricate and horrifying, writhing across the surface like they were alive. And then, I noticed something else. My name was carved into the center. I staggered back, my mind reeling, trying to make sense of it all. That's when I saw him again, the faceless man. He was standing at the edge of the clearing, his head cocked to one side, watching me. But this time he wasn't alone. There were others, dozens of them, all dressed in ragged, tattered clothing, their faces obscured by shadow. They stood in a perfect circle around the tree, completely still, as if waiting for something. The air grew heavy, suffocating, and I could feel my heartbeat slow, as if the very life was being drained from me. The faceless man raised one hand, and in that moment, everything became clear. This wasn't some random nightmare or a cruel trick. This was a ritual, and I was at the center of it. I was the offering. I tried to scream, to run, but my body refused to move. I watched in horror as the faceless man stepped forward, reaching out with those long, spindly fingers. He touched the snowboard, and the symbols began to glow, burning with a sickly green light. The ground beneath my feet started to tremble, and I felt something stir beneath the snow, something enormous, ancient, and hungry. I could feel its presence wrapping around me, squeezing the air from my lungs, and I knew that if I didn't break free now, it would consume me. Summoning every ounce of strength I had left, I tore my eyes away from the snowboard and stumbled backward, breaking the circle. The whispers grew frantic, angry, but I didn't care. I had to get out. I had to escape. I turned and ran, crashing through the trees, branches tearing at my clothes and skin, blood mixing with the snow as I fled. I didn't dare look back, even as the whispers grew louder, more desperate, pleading with me to return. But I didn't stop, couldn't. I didn't know how long I ran, but eventually, the trees began to thin, and I saw the faint glow of my cabin in the distance. My legs gave out, and I fell to the ground, gasping for breath, my body trembling with exhaustion. I looked back, expecting to see the faceless man or those shadowy figures chasing me, but there was nothing, just the dark, empty forest. I dragged myself back to the cabin, every step agony, and collapsed inside, slamming the door shut behind me. For the first time in what felt like hours, I allowed myself to breathe. But then I saw it, the snowboard. It was lying by the fireplace, as if it had never moved. The symbols were gone, and the surface was smooth, unmarked, as if everything that had happened was just some twisted hallucination. But as I stared at it, I noticed something etched in small, delicate letters, barely visible in the flickering firelight. You broke the circle. It will come for you now. My heart sank, and for the first time since this nightmare began, I felt tears streaming down my face, because I knew, deep down, that there was no escaping this. The mountain had chosen me, and no matter how far I ran, No matter where I hid, it would always find me. And this was only the beginning. Part 6. The hunt begins. I sat there in front of the fireplace, staring at those words, feeling a numbness spread through my entire body. I couldn't tell if it was the cold or if I'd simply lost the ability to feel anything other than fear. The air inside the cabin grew thicker, almost suffocating, and every shadow seemed to lengthen, reaching out toward me like claws. I reached for my phone again, desperate for some connection to the outside world, but there was still no signal. I felt utterly and completely alone, a tiny speck of life swallowed by the vast, unyielding mountain. And then the whispering began again. This time it wasn't just in my head. It was all around me, seeping through the walls, swirling around the room like a ghostly wind. I clamped my hands over my ears, but it didn't help. The voices were speaking in a language I didn't understand, but I could feel the malice in their tone, the hunger that dripped from every syllable. Suddenly, something heavy thudded against the cabin door, shaking it in its frame. I jumped to my feet, heart hammering, and took a step back. It was followed by another thud, then another, each one more forceful than the last. The door began to splinter, and I saw the handle rattle, as if something was trying to force its way inside. Without thinking, I grabbed the poker from the fireplace, holding it out in front of me like a sword. The door groaned, bending under the pressure, and I caught a glimpse of something moving outside. A dark, hulking shadow, impossibly tall and twisted, pressing against the wood. Then, everything stopped. Silence. The door went still, and for a brief moment, I thought it might be over. But then, I saw it. Something slipping through the crack between the door and the floor. It was black and thin, almost like smoke, but it moved with purpose, slithering toward me. I stumbled back, my mind screaming at me to run, to get away, but my legs refused to obey. The tendril of darkness crept closer, and as it did, I felt an intense cold wash over me, so sharp it felt like needles piercing my skin. I raised the poker and swung, and to my shock, the tendril recoiled, hissing like a snake before retreating under the door. I didn't have time to process what had just happened. I turned and bolted toward the back of the cabin, my only thought to put as much distance between myself and that door as possible. I reached the back window, fumbling with the latch, and glanced outside. The moonlight illuminated the snow, revealing something that made my blood freeze. The bare footprints, dozens of them, circling the cabin, moving in unnatural patterns, crisscrossing each other, as if whoever or whatever had made them was pacing, waiting for me to come out. I stared at them, mesmerized by the sheer number, and that's when I saw it. The faceless man. He was standing at the edge of the woods, half hidden in the shadows, but this time he wasn't alone. There were others with him now, more of those twisted figures, all staring in my direction. And then, as one, they began to move, creeping forward, their bodies swaying unnaturally, limbs bending at impossible angles. I felt a scream rising in my throat, but I choked it back, forcing myself to move. I wrenched open the window, throwing myself out into the snow, not caring that I landed hard, the cold biting into my skin. I scrambled to my feet and ran, not caring where I was going, as long as it was away from that cabin and those things. The woods closed in around me, the branches reaching out like skeletal hands, snagging on my clothes, tearing at my flesh. I pushed through, my breath coming in ragged gasps, heart pounding in my ears. I didn't dare look back, but I could feel them, closing in, the air thickening with their presence, the whispers growing louder, more urgent. I stumbled into another clearing, my legs threatening to give out, and collapsed to my knees. That's when I saw the tracks in the snow, the same animalistic prints I had followed earlier, only now they were all around me, spiraling inward toward the center of the clearing. And there, lying in the middle, was the twisted stick figure from before. It was larger now, as if it had grown, and where its head should have been, there was something new. A mask, crudely fashioned from bark and twine, with two dark holes where the eyes should be. As I stared at it, the mask seemed to shift, the holes widening, drawing me in, and I realized with a sickening lurch that it wasn't a mask at all. It was a face. My face. I scrambled backward, my mind reeling, but before I could move, I felt something wrap around my ankle. I looked down and saw one of those dark tendrils, the same one that had slipped through the cabin door, now coiled around my leg. I tried to kick it off, but it tightened, dragging me toward the center of the clearing. The whispers rose to a deafening roar, and I knew, without a doubt, that if I reached that figure, I would never escape. I grabbed at the snow, trying to find something to hold on to, but the ground beneath me began to shift, swallowing my fingers, pulling me down. "No," I gasped, clawing at the ground. "No, no, please." And then, just as suddenly as it began, everything stopped.